Nah, tahu na ing patangan di sana. Hello everyone. I hope you can hear me properly. Well, this is the first time experience for me also in one of the lessons like this. And welcome to the introduction on UNCRPD. And I hope we will be able to have a productive session. Uh, uh, so we're actually sorting a bit of technical stuff as well. Mm, So are we good? Mm, So So if you are online, I want you to switch to the broadcast tab because I will be sharing a presentation on PowerPoint. So please do switch to broadcast tab. Um, Let me see. Brilliant. So we got the call as it throughout the. So I'll share my screen now with you. and there onwards we can carry on with the presentation. So I'm activating screen share now. So here we go. Convention of the Rights of the Persons with Disabilities, and we are briefly touching on the optional protocol as well. Uh, so with I have to mention a few specific points about this particular convention, because this is the first convention that was signed by a regional integration organization, which in this case is the European Union, which means we have a great power behind us, backing us as persons with disabilities. And this convention was brought into power or brought into operation with the aim of mainstreaming the inclusion of persons with disabilities as a cross-cutting and cross-sectoral team in all the development processes as well as the rights of humans in general, which is we call human rights. So we will also try to elaborate as to what kind of presentation we are going to deal with. So this is the outline. So first we are looking at the timeline of the convention, how it happened, and what is the convention, and like how it becomes a paradigm shift for all the persons, not only just the persons with disabilities, but also for everyone else who are like responsible to carry out the tasks, particularly the state actors or the governments of the whole world. So this convention is obviously applicable for all the countries which are under United Nations, and as 52 countries of the Commonwealth, we definitely countries. So it should be our like a goal in advocacy for us to be able to mainstream and advocate for the signing and ratification of of this convention in our countries. So this is the very first slide we have. As for the timeline of the convention, this was first adopted in the 13th of December 2006 by the General Assembly, and it was open for signatures of countries on the 30th of March the next year, which is 2007. And after that, we actually great reception for this convention, because at the inception itself, there were around 82 countries coming forward to sign, and right on the day itself, like we had one country to ratify, and for the optional protocol, which actually gives the power and authority for the special committee established in this regard to look into the I mean inquiries and complaints made by individuals from each country, like as for any misconduct or any violation of their rights carried out by the respective governments. So so this was entered into force, which really means once certain number of countries ratified this convention, it entered into force on the 2008. So which means actually we are 9 years ahead of the time it was entered into force. So so the first conference of the state parties, which was held in recognition of this particular convention, UNCRPD, was held between the 31st of October and 3rd of November 2008. So the second conference happened the next year between September 2nd and 4th. So we'll be looking at this particular committee that we are talking at the next point, which is the Committee of on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which is actually overseeing the entire process of signing, ratification, and implementation, as well as monitoring the enaction of rights of the persons with disabilities in alignment with the UNCRPD in all the countries. So we have how as to how this is related which have been gone through the United Nations as disability texts. So this actually convention builds upon the said text, and we have the two texts below: the standard rules of the equalization of opportunities for the persons with disabilities. It was, brought forward in 1994, but this is not a legally binding treaty because it was just a set of standards. And then the World Program of Actions, which was actually one of which were taken with this regard way back in 1982. Um, so these are the documents on which the UNCRPD is based. We are looking at the reason as to why we need a convention like this. So in that regard, uh, the observation that until this point of time, the persons with disabilities were seen as an invisible community in the entire world, which were rather seen as objects of charity. So, in order to prevent this population being sidelined or marginalized as a minority, which ironically is the largest minority in the world that represents 1/7 of the entire world population, was ironically shoved aside. And now, at this point of time, the UNCRPD was brought into force, and unlike any other convention, this convention was enacted as a cross-cutting convention that includes and integrates all the aspects of human rights. And as you can see in the presentation itself, this is a response to the challenge of development, which was often overlooked. So this, as I told you earlier also, this represents 1/7 of the entire world population, which is close to 1 billion. And in this particular presentation, we are counting it as over 650 million because the persons with disabilities themselves are amounting to that amount, but their closest family members, their dependents, and all the other people included, that comes up to 1 billion, gaining as well. So here we go with the like nitty-gritties of this entire conversation on this convention. The Article 1 of the convention specifies the purpose, and before that there's a preamble which you can read at your leisure. Since we are battling with time as well, I'm going with the very specifics that you should know. So uh, we see the purpose as to promote, protect, and ensure the full and equal enjoyment of the human rights and fundamental freedoms by all persons with disabilities, which means did not introduce any specific new rights for the human rights paradigm, but it just that the human rights are observed as inclusive, as a cross-cutting element of persons with disabilities are also included in the observation and practicing of human rights. And whatever human rights violation that takes place is related to the persons with disabilities as well, and they are not shoved aside because they are persons with disabilities or they are any less of worthy in participating in the social development. So in the next slide, we try to investigate how this convention becomes a unique convention. So this is an instrument which is common to development and human rights, because on the one hand, for the development of the entire world, it requires a certain level of inclusiveness to make the environments equally participatory and that can be involved and enabling for everyone. And on the other hand, as I mentioned earlier, aspects, these human rights should be equal for everyone. So that's why it becomes such a necessary uh, measure for this convention to come into force. So then various forms of discriminations. So that's where this policy instrument factor comes in. So discriminations, when we look at various populations of whose rights have been specified in the UNCRPD. So as one of those rights, we see uh, for example, the indigenous persons who have disabilities, and the women with disabilities, and all these sort of cross-sector aspect is taken into account with this regard. So the other factor is, of course, there should be a legal instrument that is legally binding the governments or the states who are a part of the United Nations to implement these particular measures. So, so all these are paradigm shift uh, because the persons with disabilities, as I observed above, who were considered as the objects of charity. So, in order to mitigate this, or in order to change this attitudinal barrier as an opposing factor that determines the persons with disabilities, their independence, their equality, and their access to services, this particular policy change was a paradigm shift because it of all the rest of the world there are persons with disabilities present, and also at any time of their life anyone can be belong in this particular sector, or the particular population. So we know there are three models. Some of you might know that there are three models times which are related to the ways in which the persons with disabilities are approached. One is the charity model, where the persons with disabilities are just looked at as mere charity, people for whom everything should be given free and every service should be provided, and they don't have their own rights or independence like that. And then the social model, where the protection is offered to all the persons with disabilities, but nothing further than that. And then the medical model, where the persons with disabilities are often seen as some kind of people to be treated and healed, or some sort of medical approach is taken with regard to the persons with disabilities, but their rights are totally disregarded. But in the rights-based approach, we have a more holistic view on the persons with disabilities. So they are not being treated in a way that's sympathetic but empathetic, because they also hold rights just as everyone else is. So, so the factor that differentiates from all these other approaches and the rights-based approach is the esteem that's given to the fact of equality in dignity. So it has given the universal recognition to the dignity. So that's why this particular aspect is the right-based approach, which is observed through the convention. Um, so we have to look at the definition of disability that is followed and observed by this convention. And before everything else, I should mention that the convention looks at disability as a uh, as some sort of a uh, convention that observes the disability as an evolving concept. So definition that we have for disability today might not be the definition for disability tomorrow. So obviously we have to take that into consideration, and we can't stereotype or we can't limit our um, explorations and services and support for persons with disabilities based on a particular definition. So because of that, the convention does not try to explicitly define disability because it's an evolving concept. So the preamble I told you above, it states the definition of disability, uh, and disability actually results from the interaction between uh, persons with impairments as well as the attitudinal and environmental barriers that hinders full and effective participation, which means disability is not only about the person but about the environment in which he or she is placed. So that means just because somebody has an impairment, it doesn't mean that person should be responsible for all the difficulties that arise because of that particular impairment. For example, if somebody is using a wheelchair, that person should not be looked at in a way that uh, as a person with disability, because if the environment is conducive by creating ramps, by creating accessways broad enough for the wheelchair to pass, and creating the height of the tables and other equipment around them to be able to access while they are in the wheelchair, and all these environmental factors also should come into play. So Article 1 of the Convention states the persons with disabilities who have long-term physical, mental, intellectual, and or sensory impairments. And then again, we revert to the fact that the environment is also responsible. So the keyword is long-term, because people could be disabled and they're called temporary disabled persons because for a time in their life they are going through some sort of disability. So that does not belong exactly in here, but of course there are provisions and opportunities for such persons to be equally recognized. And so as so this is pretty much the same explanation in detail. So as I told you earlier, a person with a disability who is using a wheelchair can have a difficulty in obtaining support for employment. It shouldn't be because that he uses a wheelchair. It should be because the environment is not supportive enough for the wheelchair to be used effectively in accomplishing the targets or obligations which should be met by the particular employment opportunity. So, so for example, the simplest example is some of you who need to use glasses. If you don't have the glasses, you can't read anything perhaps. So when you have to, it's a kind of a disability. So glasses, although we don't think of it very much, is an instrument or an equipment that helps you overcome the barriers that's imposed by our environment for disability. So in case if you have larger text or if you have a more illuminated environment, you might be able to read the same text without the glasses. But actually, we can't expect the environment to be fully inclusive. So what happens is nobody's going to print you larger text because you don't have glasses. So the simple way for you to meet this challenge, overcome this challenge, is by wearing glasses for yourself. So that is pretty simple enough to look at this particular um, in the insurance of rights in this convention. And then um, we are looking at the terminology that's used in this convention. Now, usually, a lot of people talk about persons with disabilities in different terms. Some people say disabled persons, but actually, this was adopted back in the day when the label of disability was like in circulation. So they did not look at the person but the disability, so the disabled word came in front. But now we are talking about persons with disability because we are following the person first approach. So for example, now in discriminative language we don't use um, some sort of dwarfish person or something like that, but maybe a person who has dwarfism or person who has a visual impairment, stuff like that. But in each country, in each cultural dynamic, there are various ways in which the persons with disabilities are referring themselves to. In which case, as advocates who are interested in disability inclusion, we have to make it a point to respect their decision and behave ourselves and use the terminology accordingly. So the words like handicapped, uh, disabled, as I mentioned above, and also the word differently abled is no longer in use because handicaps, of course, denotes some kind of difficulty, or somewhere that you actually stoop the level of a person to a level of a beggar or something like that. So that is kind of insulting. And on the other hand, the persons we call differently abled is not really realistic, because every one of us have different abilities. So differently able does not really justify that argument about softening the blow of a persons with disabilities in a way. So now we will move on to the general principles of this convention, on based on which the convention is created. So the respect for dignity, individual autonomy, and freedom to make one's own choices, which is actually one of the most significant things that the persons with disabilities in many countries do not get to entertain, because their choices are made by others, particularly in the areas like education. Sometimes the persons with disabilities have to specific subjects, although he or she has a desire to pursue in other areas, but because the environment is not ready to accommodate them in those education institutions. So that is actually a violation of the dignity and the right to be independent and the freedom to be choosing independently. So then the non-discrimination, as we discussed earlier, uh, the discrimination is one of the perils that associates with not only persons with disabilities but many other communities. And for persons with disabilities, it's felt very sensitively, because their disabilities may not have to do with their choices. It might not be something that they have inherited by choice. So if you discriminate them on that ground, it's going to be really sensitive and really painful for them. Then the full and effective participation and inclusion in the society. We already discussed this. So that of course includes the social inclusion, as well as the rights, the outcome of ensuring these rights, which enables them to be proactive human beings who contribute to the development and the progress of the society. So respect for difference and acceptance of persons with disabilities as part of human diversity. So this means the human diversity that comprises of various ethnicities, for example, the genders themselves divide as men and women, and not only that, now we have sexual orientations, we have sexual preferences, and we have transsexual people, asexual people, and all that. So among those differences, which comprises a diversity, uh, we have to look into persons with disabilities also as a part of diversity. So next comes the most significant of these principles, the equality of opportunity. Through the ensurance of equal rights through this convention, it is the equality of opportunities that's focused by this particular convention. And then the accessibility factor is there, because in order to create an enabling environment as well as services and products for the persons with disabilities, the accessibility is key. Because in order to at least website like the EduCoders that we just used to sign into this webinar should be accessible, and it indeed is accessible. And I should really appreciate the effort of the creators of that website. And just like that, there should be opportunities, and there should be um, in all the fields of accessibility, starting from simple ramps and all the way to the high-tech gadgetry and all kinds of we are using to be 100% accessible. And that's where the uh, universal design concept comes into play, where the universality of design should be observed as a vital factor that enables all these equipment to be used by persons with disabilities alike. So equality between men and women, of course, you know, when there are female individuals with disabilities, they are considered doubly disabled in the previous approach of social protection. So now in this rights-based approach, the persons with disabilities, regardless of their gender, are given equal status in accessing the products, services, and opportunities as persons with disabilities. So the eval, as I told you earlier, the respect should be there for the evolving capacities of children with disabilities. So the generation that comes after us are more enabled and more independent and more proactive in the development process through their contribution. And it is created through the respect that we foster today through this particular convention. And also, we also have to respect the children with disabilities to preserve their identities, not only as persons with disabilities, but depending on the identify themselves according to their cultural and other sexual and other dynamics. And that is one of the key features. And also, I should remind in this particular lecture that one of the unique things about this convention is that this is the very first convention in the history of United Nations that inculcated the sexual and reproductive health rights of individuals to a convention, and it marks a milestone in that regard as well. So we'll go on for the general principles. The participation and inclusion. I think we talked about this very much in detail over the last few minutes, and how persons with disabilities also should participate in the social development. Uh, as we have mentioned in the slide, participation is important to identify the needs of the persons with disabilities. So a government, when facilitating the needs of the persons with disabilities, should not try to assume the needs and cater to those. Instead, the persons with disabilities should be allowed to participate. That's where the slogan comes: nothing without, nothing about us without us. Should be able to inculcate and include the persons with disabilities in the processes that enables them the equal participation. So, so Article 3 of the convention actually recognizes this equal participation, and and in the general obligations which are specified in the Article 4 for the governments and bodies that sign and ratify this convention should be also indicative of this factor of participation. And in Articles 29 and 30 also, if you closely look at them, the same rights have been enshrined. So we'll move on to that non-discrimination, how non-discrimination is observed. Uh, so, so human rights law in the international arena has the fundamental principle that upholds this particular value of non-discrimination, and this is where the UNCRPD relates to the international covenants and make sure that the persons with disabilities are also represented in the avenues of discrimination. So it includes direct and indirect discrimination. And one of the key concepts that we encounter in looking at the persons with disabilities and how their rights are ensured is the reasonable accommodation. This means necessary and appropriate modifications and adjustments, not imposing an disproportionate or undue burden of those who make those adjustments. Uh, so this could be identified as, if you are ensuring that a person with disability is employed in a certain institution, that institution should cater to their needs. If a wheelchair user is hired as an employee, they should make sure that the doorways are accessible, the ramps are in place, and lifts are there for them to floor by floor, etc. So, and for those who try to adopt the policies which makes the inclusion of visually impaired persons in their employment process should be able to install screen readers in their computers and provide guidance in and out of the buildings, and whenever make a visit to a certain place or location for some work related uh, obligation, they should be given somebody to accompany and all that. So that kind of adjustments actually can be done uh, with less cost, and the returns could be very productive as well. So it is not an undue burden. So the employer should not go out of the way, but instead they should consider humanely and empathetically and make these changes in their workplace environment. Uh, Next, we are looking at another most significant general principle, which is accessibility. So accessibility is not only a general principle, but an standalone article in the convention. Article 9, if you closely look at it, it lists down all the accessibility related provisions, and the access must be ensured in this regard to justice above all. We all should be able to go in the protection of law, which is equal for everyone, and access to justice means at least the courts, decisions of the court should be accessible for the persons with disabilities. The services which are offered by the ministries of justice and all the entities related to the legal field should be looked at. And in the community participation also, the persons with disabilities should have sufficient provisions to live independently and provide the inputs in whatever social endeavors that they wish to participate and contribute in. And ICT, as I mentioned now, the EduCoders also have done a brilliant job. And likewise, the ICT aspect should be observed as well. So if you really want to look at one of those greatest examples as to how ICT is made accessible fully to everyone, you can check out the website the Malta has created. They're not only giving the access in English, but in their local language. And there's a engine which can be specifically used for the persons with visual impairments if they want to read it in Maltese language. So education is one of the vital things with which the persons with disabilities can make themselves heard by moving up the ladder in society. So education should be also equally accessible. And health, of course, we can't forget health when it comes to persons with disabilities, because it is with health that they could those who have the capacity of life with certain support, or uh, maybe return to the state of not having a disability through the support of health services. So health services should definitely be accessible. And habilitation and rehabilitation is one of the main aspects. Just as the basic needs of the humans goes, everybody should have a shelter, and they should be habilitated. They should be provided accommodation. They should be provided residences in areas and where the livelihood is possible with equal access and equal opportunities and equal support. So even the rehabilitation aspect of this is related to persons who had not been given the due care, and later on, if they are adopted to the mainstream social stream, they have to be rehabilitated and make more socially friendly by providing them the skills necessary for that and empowering them. So work and employment, we have been talking for a while, and it has a dedicated article, the article number 27. Human resource policies and practices include in this article are necessary, and then we go on to the standards of living. Through that also we can ensure the persons with disabilities have enough protection as well as the independence to live. And participation in political and social life, that's one of my favorite topics, because in Sri Lanka we have been conducting various advocacy initiatives as well as a policy brief for the political rights and representations of persons with disabilities. So in other countries also, they should be having access to decision-making process regardless of their disability. So participation in cultural recreation and other entertainment avenues also should be open to persons with disabilities. So that is where we are looking at the convention, and then we move on to the structure of the convention. This is, I'm going to quickly go through this slide because you can observe this particular structure on your own. So I'm going to quickly go through these two slides. Uh, and as you can see, it really sort of creates some kind of a elaborate structuring. So so we will try to um, okay, we will try to uh, quickly go through those two slides. So as you can see, this particular website lists down all the articles you can read online itself and quickly browse through this. See this very very elaborate and very precise. We will move on with the rest of the structural attributes of the particular article, and this is the second layer of the structure. And also uh, so we are going ahead with the rights in the convention. So equality before the law without discrimination is one of the rights ensured through UNCRPD. Right to life, liberty, and security, because without life, right to life, we can't proceed with anything else. And where it is concerned, when the persons with disabilities are born as infants or children, the parents have no right whatsoever to discard them, disregard them, and the governments and entities should have mechanisms in place to support those parents. So that includes in this particular aspect, and it does not uh, really allow the certain countries to impose extreme measures like using the persons with disabilities for experiments, torture, and all kinds of. So, as I mentioned about, they are recognized as equal before the law, regardless. And then the Article 15, as I mentioned about the freedom from torture, just because a person is a person with disability, regardless of its physical, mental, or otherwise, whatsoever for any government to hold them as torture victims and all that. And they should not be subjected to violence and exploitation or abuse because the persons with disabilities have a much more likelihood of being exploited, violated, and abused than the other persons, which is an inherent vulnerability. And the states should make sure that they bring legislative measures into action in order to prevent those. So that is one of the aspects, and we have the right to respect physical and mental integrity of persons with disabilities, which is specified through Article 17. You can read them leisurely. And Article 18 is about freedom of movement and nationality. Just because a person is having a disability, he or she should not be restricted in movement uh, to confine them to a certain location, and there should not be locations which are like those days, uh, there are particular establishments which had said blacks and dogs are not allowed, like that disabled are not allowed, is not allowed, right? So the right to live in the community, this particularly looks at the possibility of certain states secluding the persons with disabilities to particular geographical areas, and this negates the possibility of having such specific restrictions and gives the persons with disabilities to live and equally have the right to live with the rest of the community that he prefers. And freedom of expression and opinion, of course, persons with disabilities should be having freedom to express, and this is ensured through actually the UDHR as well. And Article 21 of the convention looks at this particular requirement. And respect for privacy, on the other hand, just because a person with disability needs to seek support of the others in certain affairs, the respect should be there in those people to observe the privacy of those persons. So just for example, if a visually impaired person asks you to read a very confidential document, you are not supposed to go around and tell everyone that what you read in that particular document. So the governments also should not be able to pry into the personal and confidential things that persons with disabilities have to in their lives. So respect for home and the family is Article 23, which actually means that the person with disabilities also have equal right to have a family and get married, and nobody have an authority of influencing them against or for it or anything like that. So that independence of decision making with regard to having a family is there for the persons with disabilities solely at their discretions at this convention. So right to education, as we discussed earlier, is dedicated by the Article 24. So we have to have equal opportunities for education for the persons with disability, regardless of their difficulties. And right to health, as we discussed earlier, the health also is one of the most significant patterns. Then right to work, also I don't think we have to reiterate this because we discussed earlier as well. And the adequate standard of living, which means the persons with disabilities should be also given living that are enjoyed by the rest of the society, and the right to participate in political and public life. You can look at Article 29 to look at the particular rights set out with this regard. Right to participation in cultural life, as we discussed, the persons with disabilities should have the equal opportunities in cultural life of their respective communities. And you can look at the article number 30. So that is one of the, and this is a lesser looked at aspect, the international cooperation. I think the Commonwealth has a greater role in this particular aspect of this convention. The number 32, the article number 32 looks at this particular uh, requirements, and the international development programs should consider mainstreaming disability and, and all the development activities, and also um, there should be measures which are specific for disabilities to make sure that the inclusion happens effectively. And this is where like long ago that we looked at MTGS, now we are looking at SDGs, and in order to make sure that the goals set out by SDGs are accomplished, we have to include the persons with disabilities. And I think the SDGs number 10 and particularly looks at the reducing of inequality, where the persons with disabilities are also empowered. And that is the main thing. Also, uh, so international human rights law also recognizes the particular rights of persons with disabilities, and it does not mean that sidelined or anything, because internationally the persons with disabilities have the recognition, and in this the specific concept of the progressive realization, because the limitation of resources in certain countries which might not be afford certain things should be made available for persons with disabilities. So that should not become an excuse, but instead, under the concept called progressive realization, the other countries should provide them some time frame and allow them to go ahead and implement those provisions in their countries. So, so there should be also strategies to use these limited resources in order to get the maximum. So target low-cost programs, targeting people in the most marginalized communities, and all that in priority can be very effective measures. And so the persons with disability should be included in all stages. So we have the existing processes how we could mention mainstream disability. Uh, in the Article 4, the point 1 uh, observes that protection and promotion of human rights should be taken into account by the state parties. So that is one of the key measures, and Human Rights Council and all these entities should be kept up to date, and uh, and common country assessment is one of the significant things. So we are looking at that as well. So, and poverty is one of the most significant aspects with which the persons with disabilities are submerged in priority in the state sector development. So poverty should be addressed and empowerment should take place, and this is one of the requirements that the government should um, take into consideration. And also census which are conducted countrywide should take into account how persons with disabilities should be catered, and programs and policies specifically for women who are considered doubly marginalized in terms of their disability and in terms of them being women should be taken into consideration. And there are many others like that. So the no gap policy also is uh, a similar policy level recommendation. So interconnected network of actors, and both state and non-state should be ready at hand to address these difficulties. And and this is actually something that the Commonwealth should take into consideration. How accessible are the activities? So I'm gonna due to time constraints. And again, I will be sharing this presentation with you, so you can look at it more inquisitively. So convention bodies that are in operation. The conference of state parties is held every year, and the committee of the persons with disabilities, committee that's established to look at the rights of the persons with disabilities also assembles every year twice at Geneva to discuss and bring any proposed amendment, or also to investigate uh, sort of any complaints that have been received uh, by the committee as per the uh, uh, as per the particulars set out in the optional protocol of UNCRPD. Um, and also this committee is comprising of 18 members. Actually, it was initially composing of 12 members, the six of whom should be like re-elected in the next 4 years time, and six should be replaced by general vote, which includes the voting of state parties which are gathered in conferences every year. So so they are tasked with this particulars that has been mentioned in the slide. And then as there were about 60 ratifications and signings of the UNCRPD, the more participation was ensured. That's where the 18 members were elected with additional six from the initial 12. And then moving on, this is the where place where we look at the optional protocol. So optional protocol is pretty much about creating a mechanism that can enable this committee to investigate into specific complaints made by individuals against their governments for not carrying out the provisions and recommendations set out by the UNCRPD. So we should not be dealing in detail with this. So this is national monitoring and implementation mechanism. Again, this is to do with the optional protocol. So every country should have, when they are including them, the provisions of UNCRPD in their uh, the legislature, they should be able to mobilize these particular monitoring and evaluation independence, which should be inclusive for the persons with disabilities, and they are uh, caveats and their requirements should be given the priority. So, so this is the UN implementation. We really don't have to concern ourselves much about this. And then this special rapporteur of disability in United Nations is the entity to whom we should actually provide our inputs and reports so that they are included in the reports submitted by this person. Currently, it's Catalina Divandas Anguilla, who's from Costa Rica, who's doing the reporting these particular times. So you can look her up and communicate with her if your respective countries have difficulties of this nature. So again, so this also, as I mentioned about, all should be inclusive for the persons with disabilities. And now this is where we are summing it up all together. So, so now we have the challenge of implementing the provision set out by this convention, and people should be trained and the capacities should be built among the persons with disabilities to advocate as well as to support the implementation of this convention. And it should be necessary to mainstream the uh, disability inclusion in all the sectors as a cross-sectoral aspect, and the organization should also inculcate the principle particular uh, uh, session. And as I mentioned about, the all stages of implementation should be inclusive for the persons with disabilities. So it is under these particular categories that we are looking at, as in how we could inculcate the UNCRPD. So this is, to sum it up, this is just a set of standards that the government should be followed. Mm, So, so in that regard, I think I think you gain some insight to this particular uh, presentation we made, and I hope to disseminate this presentation in the uh, lesson itself so that you can browse and obtain more insight, and you can there are a list of references made for the persons with disabilities to investigate more on this. So thank you for listening up. I hope we are pretty much on time. And in case if you could not see the presentation that I shared with you, that will be available to download from the lesson websites that you can download and dis disseminate among your friends and peers as well. So I think that the time's pretty much up. And if you have any questions, please email me on enablelankafoundation@gmail.com, and I'll be happy to answer and contribute in the way I could. And thank you for listening in.